Fascinating discussion. Thank you very much for the opportunity. And thank you for the opportunity to come back to this lovely area of the country. It was a wonderful chance. Came across yesterday from a presentation I did in Pittsburgh. So got a lovely view of the valley coming in, and it's always nice to get back to this area. Let's see what happens when I do that. Ah, it moved. Hallelujah. Les is in the back going like this. We take our victories where we can get these some days, right? Exactly. All right. So that you have some sense of why in the heck I might be worth listening to, let me give you a little bit of my background. You heard about the Cleveland piece, which I didn't think anybody in New York would actually hold against me. Pittsburgh, I knew that was going to happen, but go figure. I started out life I have a very sort of quintessentially Cleveland sort of background. My father and my grandfather ran a paint factory, a small paint factory in a town in the Cleveland area that actually looks a lot like where we are today. This is not the factory, but it looks a lot like it. When I was relatively young, I was about 12 years old, that factory folded and was sold for its assets in sort of one of the first great dislocations of the transition from the industrial economy to whatever the thing is that we're in today. As a result, I think, of that experience, I ended up going, when I went to school, I eventually morphed. I've gone through 3 or 4 different careers, eventually morphed into a planner. For me, and I'm still a planner. In fact, I'm speaking at a planning conference next week, so I have to put my planner hat back on. But for me, the planning process was a little bit unsatisfactory because too often this was our situation. And it says we had a plan. Sadly, the plan was a bad one. As a result, I think of that experience of growing up in Cleveland when I did, I always had a bent toward economic development and economic revitalization, which has been more and more part of my practice over the last several years. And again, when you work, particularly in the Midwest, a lot of the issues of economic dislocation, which I know you folks have dealt with here as a result of things like IBM for a very long time. It's a good thing I saw this little screen come up before, because the whole blacklist thing was starting to make me wonder if I was in trouble or not. So, whoops, that would be the backwards. This will be the forwards. So, as I have become more and more involved in the economic development end of the business, though, I also have become pretty frustrated with how we've typically done economic development particularly in the US, although we see this model carried out to a great extent across the world. And the conventional model of economic development tends to be focused on the big project, right? Does that sound like familiar territory for you folks? Economic development, you get their attention when you have a very large project, when you're going to build something that involves a big crane. And when it's a new something coming to town, then the reaction is, woohoo! We will give you tax incentives. We'll help you build the thing. We'll put in roads. We are rocking and rolling. We are ready to go. Conventionally, that's been the lion's share of what your economic development people are trained to do and are told is their job. Whether they're in a local government setting or a regional setting, whether they are within a local government proper or within a nonprofit. That's kind of the message that they have tended to get for a long time. And there is increasingly another little piece that I know a few people who are very excited about business retention, but the vast majority kind of look at it like this. Yeah, I know. We got to work with the people who are here. We have to help them out. Yeah, we know. Okay. Fine, all right, we'll go talk to them. Not quite the same level of enthusiasm. But what happens, and this is where my biggest frustration came in. Recruitment, I have some issues with the amount of effort that we sometimes put into recruitment in the economic development world. Don't hit yourself there, Della. I also understand the retention piece, resonated to that a little more myself, but felt like that wasn't being very effective and struggled with that for a long time. And what finally struck me was that the way your local communities have tended to do economic development has been the individual business focus. So they want to talk to you. They want to talk to company X. They want to talk to company Y. So it's a very, very linear kind of focus. What happens, though, we don't want to go that way. Let's go that way. That's a method that comes out of that old industrial revolution. It's a very mid-20th century sort of model. And it's a mid-20th century model in that, I would argue, it was set up for those big businesses. If your economy is made up of a small number of big gorillas, you can afford a very linear focus on this gorilla and that gorilla and that gorilla. It makes sense. It works. The problem is, as you folks know, we're just going to start pushing buttons here. The problem is, as you folks know, the world doesn't look like that previous picture anymore. It looks more like this. And in fact, even over the last 10 years, the average size of a business in the US has declined from an average of 17 people per business, which wasn't very high and was much, much higher earlier, in the 20th century. Just over the last 10 years, that average size has declined from 17 to 15 people. Over 10 years. That's an average for the nation. That's a substantial change. During the same time period, the number of self-employed persons went up by 14%. How many of you are self-employed who are sitting in this room today? That's, for those of you who can't see these folks, that's over half of this room. So if I had asked that question 30 years ago to a room similar to this, I probably would not have gotten that kind of response. So here's the premise. I think we need to look as people who are residents of communities, as people who work with communities, as people who play some kind of a role, whether it's as a business leader or as an official or as a member of a nonprofit or a leader of a nonprofit. We have to change how we're thinking about the very nature of doing local economic development. We need to do that in a manner that will not only make it more effective, but will make it more effective for organizations precisely like yours. And I'll explain why in a minute. But here's the catch. I work with economic developers. I work with planners. These are good-intentioned people. These are people who are working hard. These are people who, by and large, want to do the right thing. But they don't have your perspective. They don't see what you see being out there in the trenches. So the challenge to you folks is that we cannot afford anymore to sit back and let our economic development professionals, our local government professionals, do this work for us. We really have to be, as members of our own communities, as members of our own regions, we have to play a critical role in pushing forward that kind of change. Here's that virus thing again. I've never even heard of that one. Oops. Hang on for technical, we don't know what's going on here. Sarah, can you get Les, please? Sorry about that, folks. The computer doesn't seem to, okay, wait, here we go. All right, we're Sarah, if you can hear me, we're okay. All right, so I've been pounding my head against this for quite a while. I still have some hair left, but it's been a little bit of a struggle. And what struck me, I'll put this a different way, is that we've tended to approach the process of growing local economies as an industrial process. Anybody know what this thing is? Ooh, bravo, gold star. You know your machinery. Yes, this is a paper mill. And I actually have some earthly clue how these things work because, we got it, Les, we're good. I actually have some clue how these things work because my husband used to run one for Procter & Gamble. He's had many jobs over his career, and in most cases I have no idea what he did. But when he ran the paper mill, I could say he runs a paper mill. And it's a lovely example of an industrial process because you take the slurry, which is the pulp mixed in with a lot of water, you shove it into one end of this giant machine that stretches about a city block, and this happens, and then that happens, and then that happens, and it pulls the water out and squashes the paper fibers together, and lo and behold, at the end, you've got a roll of paper. It's a very linear process. Things move through from one end to another. The problem is that we've tended to treat the key question of how do we make our local community grow, how do we create a viable economic life for our communities, we've tended to treat it as an industrial process. We input on this end, we put in money, we put in people, we put in businesses, stuff happens, and then out on the other end comes what we wanted, that wonderful quality of life. And anybody who tells you that economic development exists to generate jobs isn't telling you the whole story. Economic development, what's it really about? It's about making a place where people can live and thrive and be healthy and happy and make a living, right? Jobs are a way to get there. But it's about much more. Ultimately, economic development is about much more than that. So we've tended to think about it as this sort of input-output process, when in reality, it's more of an ecosystem. So communities thrive when the pieces interrelate to each other, when the structures reinforce each other, when there's enough flexibility in the system to create resilience, so that when you get hit with something like we got hit when I was growing up with the decline of the steel industry and the auto industry, when you get hit with that, you have the ability to bounce back. That's ultimately what we want for our places, right? Now you folks, and particularly you folks who are online, you know, you're dealing in, as Les very clearly articulated, a global world. You're dealing with something that has to do with not just your local community. You are not dependent on your local communities the way, you know, your local barber is. But you have this global community, and so that's certainly part of your ecosystem. And that's a piece that Les and iCAN are very equipped to talk about. My life is at the local level, and I can tell you that one of the things that so often becomes a barrier for small businesses, whether they're industrial businesses or service businesses or technology or kind of routine run-of-the-mill retail and the like, is that our ability to thrive independently depends on what the rest of the world around us, particularly in our immediate environs, look like. How many of you have ever had to try to hire somebody? A few. Okay. I got about half of the hands in the room raised on that one. If you're in a place, if you need somebody to physically come and be with you, which isn't always the case anymore, but still is very often, if you need someone to come and be with you, if you need to have a client come to visit you, you want to have a place that looks like somewhere where they want to be, right? That's a key challenge. And not every place can be everything to everyone. But that we underestimate the value of that local environment on our ability to be successful. And part of the challenge is whether we are an international business or a local business, we have a tendency to think of ourselves as cowboys, right? Is that not the nature of the entrepreneur? I'm on my second startup. This is my second business. In between my first business and my second business, I worked for a series of engineering firms. I was the planner, the economic development specialist within a planning group within an engineering company. And I ultimately left that environment, which was stable and lucrative. I have words, I do. I ultimately left that environment because I was too much of a cowboy, because I wanted to do things my way and in the way that made sense to my perspective. And that ran into loggerheads with the engineering company, bureaucracy, modus operandi. This is the way we do it. So, I understand and I get that as entrepreneurs, as small business owners, whether we are a global technology firm or we are a local firm that supplies services to that global business, that we have a tendency to want to be cowboys. But the fact of the matter is that we don't have the capacity to be cowboys. You don't have that capacity. I don't have that capacity. And the small businesses that you depend on in your local community for everything from your technology services to the people who do your dry cleaning don't have the capacity to be fully independent cowboys anymore. We're all cut too close to the bone. We're all doing the most we can with the least we can. We're all working as hard as we possibly can, and very few of us have any substantial slack in the system anymore. And that's a deep challenge. And that's a very deep challenge for economic developers because they don't have any slack in the system anymore either. So if your regional economic development folks are going to go around saying, I got to focus on this industry and this business and that business, they don't have the capacity to do that for everybody, and they certainly don't have the capacity, if they're taking it from that model, to do that for you. So we really need to shift the model. Shift the model of how local communities and regional entities do economic development from a I will work with you and I will work with you to the process of creating systems that reinforce each other, systems that can work together. You've got that through iCAN within this industry. That's very effective. You need that from your local communities as well. And my challenge to you would be, if you don't push them to do it, they're not going to do it. So what does that mean? Some of this, for those of you who have dealt with local economic development, is going to look kind of familiar. So think about this within that framework of how do you build a reinforcing system among all of the different kind of businesses in your community that depend on each other. What is it that they need? What is it that iCAN provides to you that needs to be part of the larger system? Well, one is the tool set. You folks have access through iCAN to some very extraordinary training and counseling and mentoring and resources. But you're not an island. You're dependent on your local community to some form or another. What kind of resilience, what kind of training, what kind of knowledge base do the local businesses that you need for your success, what kind of training and resources do they have? Let me show you a couple of particular issues. Every time I do that, it goes back to this. Da-dum-bump. Okay. Now I can't find the mouse. Hello. Let's say resume. We like that. Yes. Okay, there we go. All right. So what else do they need? Well, I asked before how many of you were self-employed. Everybody here know the term 1099er? Okay, I'm seeing a few of these kind of nods. You never see the nod on that one. You see the, oh God, yeah. Freelancer is the more conventional term for that. But especially in a region like this, where people choose to live here for certain amenities, where people may feel that they have to be here because of family connections or something like that, you have a 1099er economy that is a very, very significant part of what you need in order to have that vibrant economy. And that includes tax base, that includes services, that includes all of those things that I've described. Your average 1099er may not have the level of knowledge of how to survive in this world that you have. What do they need to know about how to manage their lives, how to manage their resources, how to manage simple facts like the fact that they don't have an employer providing them with health care? It sounds like it's their problem. My argument would be it's all of our problem. And I can't change the feds, I can't change the SEC, but I can work on building resilience into that local piece of the economy. Another is retirement. I heard somebody talking before we started today about retirement issues. If you think retirement is a tough issue for you folks, just wait until you start looking at the retirement issues associated with the local service providers. This guy owns a newsstand in London. This is not a life and death sort of business, but it's an important part of that community. And the challenge he's facing is, as he gets closer and closer to retirement, there's a sense that a lot of folks have that, especially if they have a brick facility, I'm just going to sell it. I'm going to get a realtor. I'm going to put it on the market. It's going to sell. I'm going to get this wonderful little pile of money, and off I go to my sailboat in Aruba. And in reality, it doesn't work that way. So for the self-interest of ourselves as people who are dependent on our local communities to some form or another, making sure that these kind of people can transition and not just leave vacant storefronts, I think becomes very, very critical for all of us. Here's a favorite one. Anybody know what this is? I doubt that you can read it too awful closely from where you are. It's mostly in, and this is only a part of the actual chart. This is the permit process for the city of Cincinnati, Ohio. And I'm probably going to get in trouble for putting this up on the internet, but okay, nobody can read it anyways. It's just got a lot of stuff, right? Okay. It's actually multiple permit processes that if you're doing this, you might need that and you might need this. I am not, because I'm a planner, because I deal a lot in the repercussions that one element of a community has on another element of a community, I'm not an advocate for let's wipe out zoning, let's wipe out regulations, let's wipe out permits, let's just let everybody do whatever they want. That is, from where I have seen that happen, that's death. What does so often become a problem, and I'm working on a project in Cincinnati right now where this is a critical issue, is that this process, not only is it cumbersome, and in this case we know it's more cumbersome than it needs to be, not only is it complex, not only is it time-consuming, but nobody knows what the heck they're supposed to be doing. And so if we as people of a community can advocate, can push for this to be not just simplified, improved, streamlined, whatever, but made understandable to the person who needs to come in and get a building permit, get an occupancy permit, get a liquor permit, then we have an opportunity to lower the cost of doing business and make it easier for those very thin-stretched people that we need to function in our local economy to be able to do it. You're probably all familiar with crowdsourcing spaces. I had to explain this a good deal in Pittsburgh the other night, and I would have had to explain the antivirus thing too. You know, the ability to do co-working space becomes critical. In some communities, that's a much, much harder thing to do than others. If a community is resistant to this idea, if the local zoning and permitting does not facilitate this, then that becomes a significant barrier to certain kinds of businesses. Same with restaurants. And, you know, I'm in New York, so you recognize this picture. Tony Say, who's the president of Zappos and has been instrumental in trying to revitalize downtown Las Vegas, Nevada, said relatively recently that part of the reason why he wanted to relocate Zappos to this city, to downtown Las Vegas, was because in a city, every restaurant, every bar becomes a potential conference room. So we tend to think of restaurants and bars and places like this as this kind of little fluff, this amenity, this extra thing. And if it happens, great, and if not, well, yeah, the planners will tell you that the local residents are always yelling for restaurants. But, yeah, you know, it's not all that important. Within the new economy, within that local ecosystem, they become incredibly important. Here's another little idea of a way that local communities can help to get people off the ground. Within the cities in this region, how many of them do you think have a farmer's market? Or a downtown market of some sort? Okay, pretty much everyone. This is the market in Cincinnati, Ohio. And it's not just a farmer's market, it's an actual standalone market. And I know you have those in this region because this one was modeled on one in New York. This was built in 1850. It was pre-Civil War. I might have the date wrong a little bit. But Findlay Market was the first public market of this type on the other side of the Appalachian Mountains. Within Findlay Market, there are somewhere between 15 and 20 stalls. These are startup spaces. In some cases, they're businesses that have been there for a very, very long time. In some cases, generations. But it also becomes a critical startup space. So here's my favorite example. This is a man named Jean-Francois, and he is a native of Belgium. He came to Cincinnati. I believe his wife is from here. No background, no connections, no nothing. No equity. Jean-Francois, who is now my son's, he was described as being 9, he's now 10, I need to update that. My 10-year-old's favorite person in the world. In fact, I told him I was putting him in this presentation, he said, "Oh, the Taste of Belgium guy." And I said, "You got it." He started with a stall in Findlay Market that's no bigger than this podium, no bigger than this dais that I'm on right now. Made waffles. Low rent, low startup. Through your accelerator services here at iCAN, you're doing the same thing. Low cost way to get started. He now has, after about 10 years, a stall in Findlay Market, which is wildly successful, a stall in another city's downtown market, which is wildly successful, a food truck in another city, so he's now in 3 different cities, which are couple hours apart, and a restaurant now about 5 blocks from where that Findlay Market is that serves $30 plates and beers that you can't get anywhere else in that region. And he's doing extremely well. I haven't seen his balance sheet, but I tell you, the place is always jammed. He would not have been able to get to that restaurant without either having somebody, some sugar daddy helping him along, or without the opportunity to start in Findlay Market. You guys know this within iCAN. My challenge to you is your communities. You need these kinds of opportunities within your communities as well if your communities are going to support the places that you need for your business. Everybody familiar here with Babson College? That's in Massachusetts, up near Boston. This was a great quote from them. Entrepreneurs and others who put together the information. So all of this stuff I've been talking about to date is mostly about tools. it's information, it's space. It's simple, simple things. Not only does it benefit the entrepreneurs, but what Babson has found is that in the process, entrepreneurs and other stakeholders in the system, so that's the whole community, learn to be collaborative, transparent, and proactive. And Les and I had a conversation about the role of government in solving economic issues. And I think he and I share a perspective in that no government's going to be able to make it happen. But what they can do, I would argue, is create and facilitate the process of getting that system on its feet. Quickly, a couple of other kind of more esoteric things. As we build networks build that ecosystem through information, through space, through these kinds of very basic level resources, what we really have the opportunity to do, but we have to be conscious about it, is to knit resources together, is to knit businesses into not just a bunch of businesses, a bunch of cowboys out there all trying to do their own thing, but to knit the businesses together into a more cohesive whole. Just like when you knit, when you physically knit, which I am incredibly horrible at. But when you knit, you take different segments of the yarn that are separated from each other, and you put them right next to each other. And when you put them right next to each other, you create something that is stronger and in many cases more useful and more flexible often than the individual piece of yarn by itself. What does that mean? Well, of course it means buying and selling, which is the piece that people usually default to first. If I buy your services and you provide me with my materials, we're like knitted together, kind of, aren't we? Well, yes and no. Businesses need to be able to share and have peer learning, and I'll show you another lovely quote from Babson in a minute. But that process of peer learning, of peer commiserating, you have that here. You have that online. You have that through iCAN. Your communities need that as well. And not just among technology businesses or retail businesses or whatever, but across that whole cross-section. How often do we learn best from people who are a little different from us? I'm going to gloss this part because you've obviously talked about crowdfunding a great deal lately. And I understand and I appreciate the concerns with the SEC. I do think that it's a matter of when, not a matter of if. This stuff is coming. So obviously you're familiar with Kickstarter. Let me point out to you a couple that are very, very new on the horizon. And I think the question's still out as to what they're ultimately going to look like. But this kind of thing is occurring. There's two new ones. One is called Brickstarter, and the other is called Small Knot. And these are similar to Kickstarter. They're crowdfunding platforms, but they're focused on the local level. And there was an interesting quote from the Kauffman Foundation, which is, of course, very heavy into entrepreneurship, talking about they have a program called iStart, which is essentially a kind of nascent crowdfunding platform. And here's the quote. I actually thought about putting it in and decided I would just verbalize it to you instead. As part of the explanation of iStart, Kauffman Foundation said, as a result of this tool, anyone can scan thousands of business concepts that cover everything, from internet startups to consumer goods to green innovations. Thousands. Do you have time to weed through thousands of opportunities? And there's search functions. You can narrow it down. But that becomes very overwhelming. So as we look at these local ecosystems, as crowdfunding evolves, particularly in the US, but really anywhere, finding ways for people increasingly want to invest, people who are not traditional investors, who don't have a deep understanding of the kinds of technological work that you folks do, people like me who just want to have a better community are going more and more to wanting these kind of environments. So ultimately, what we're working on building here is interdependence. We are trying to create an environment in which you have the opportunity to benefit from everybody else, but where each individual business also understands that we have to be in it together, that we can't be cowboys anymore. So here's another quote from Babson. When different communities have different needs, different elements of your local economy have different needs, there's value placed in cross-pollination. And the strongest ecosystems, and this is about economies, not about birds and plants and things, support healthy connections across a variety of communities. I used to be told that entrepreneurs were like cockroaches. You put out the stuff they need, and they'll all just kind of come in from anywhere, and they'll grab what they need, and they'll run back to their corners. And I was told that by a very, very wise woman. And I've used that line for years. And I'm coming to the conclusion more and more that it's not quite that simple, that we need to facilitate that process. And we can't leave it just to local governments. We can't leave it just to local nonprofits. We all have a role to play in helping to advocate and push forward for that to happen. So thank you. I really appreciate your time this morning. Les, do you want to take questions?
Sure.
Does anybody have questions or comments? Yes, and you're going to have to do the mic thing again.
Do the mic thing.
Either that or I can repeat it, and then I'll work very hard on getting it wrong.
Who typically, in best case, should have the job of facilitating the cross-pollination? In other words, you could say Hudson Valley Center for Innovation, iCAN, but what if the powers that be don't necessarily buy in or listen?
One of the things, I worked in Main Street, and the Main Street program in New York works a little differently than it does in many states. Main Street is a downtown revitalization strategy, and that it's been in place for about 30 years across the country. One of the things that Main Street figured out a very long time ago is that any kind of meaningful change in a community needed to be a partnership. It needed to have the local government as part of it. The local government has to be part of the equation. Local organizations have to be part of the equation, and communities. It really needs to be a collaborative process. That's why it's hard, and that's why so often it does not happen easily and happen quickly. It also takes time to build that combination and that collaboration. And so one of the things that I often see communities do, whether the impetus is coming from a local government or coming from a nonprofit or coming from somebody in the community who's just kind of got the fire in the belly, what I very often see is that person or that organization tries 2 or 3 things. You know, they'll do an event like this and they'll do it 3 times. And the first time 3 people show up, and the next time 2 people show up, and the next time maybe 4 people show up. And they go, this isn't working. It's not going to happen. Yeah, give up. Okay, try something else. So often we fail, especially in something messy and complicated like getting a local community to work in a sustainable fashion. We give up too soon. And so that process of building that collaboration, it's not easy. And sometimes there's personalities, there's history, there's baggage, there's particular individuals who don't get it. And then it becomes important to figure out, how do we work around that history? How do we work around that baggage? But it's that process of figuring it out that I think becomes the most important. And where it doesn't happen, it's almost always because somebody said, he's not going to listen. We tried that 20 years ago. It's not going to work. Not going to try.
Joe, I'd like to come back to a little, I don't know if that's working now.
Nope.
I'd like to come up to a different aspect of your discussion. And that was brought up before, something called risk.
Risk.
Risk is a dangerous game that more and more economic development agencies and organizations have very serious trepidations about getting involved in. And as we discussed before, if the majority of new business creation is coming from small business, and there's nothing more risky on this planet than an emerging technology company trying to come onto the scene, take that part, coupled with, we know that by and large, technology companies today don't hire the amount of people that companies once did. They don't need the amount of capital that they once did, and their chances of succeeding to become self-sustaining are actually on the rise.
Mm-hmm.
What's the role of economic development? What do you think the role of economic development could be in working in the area of risk, entrepreneurship, and emerging companies, given all those parameters?
That's an excellent question. And part of it comes back, I think the critical component of that comes back to that paradigm shift that I have argued needs to occur within the very nature of how we conceive the job of doing economic development. As I said earlier on, we have this history in terms of local and regional economic development of focusing on the big project, the big thing. And when we focus on the big project and the big thing, we know there's going to be big demands in terms of cost, infrastructure, whatever, but we also know that there's going to be potentially some kind of reward. And we've got the history and and we think we can project all this stuff out. And then as you found out your neighbors in Rhode Island found out recently, just because you think you got it all figured out doesn't mean diddly squat. What I would argue this change to an ecosystem idea necessitates or creates is a shift from thinking about the big bets to the little bets. As you pointed out, the kind of businesses that you're talking about may be riskier, but they're also, the amount that they needed to risk is much smaller than it used to be. I was in a neighborhood in Pittsburgh the other day where I met with a man who used to be a funder for LISC, which is the Local Initiative Support Corporation, or Coalition. It's one of those. LISC is in most cities nationally. You've certainly got a LISC outfit here in this region. And LISC comes out of the community development tradition. Typically, they put money into the big impossible projects. They put money into the things that nobody thought would ever work. So they became the lender of last resort. What this gentleman found out, and he now is running an organization that he helped to get started as a investor, as the person who facilitated investments for LISC. What he figured out was that it was much more effective to put small investments strategically placed into initiatives and organizations that didn't need much, and that maybe were risky, maybe they were trying something new, but had the potential to do something that nobody else had been able to figure out how to do yet. And by doing that, he realized that I could take a risk. I've got lots of small bets out there. And if this bet doesn't pay off or this bet doesn't pay off, I'm okay. And that goes back again. I think as crowdfunding does get on its feet in the US, and I do think it's a matter of time. I think the SEC will do whatever it will do, but the pressure and the impetus is there, and I see it in the local communities at a furious pace growing these days. I think that paradigm shift to, instead of the giant bets, to the little bets is going to greatly mitigate that risk. It's a portfolio diversification.
I don't disagree, but we had a brief conversation on the way up this morning, and one of the analogies that I used is a hardware store. Mm-hmm. You don't see many local hardware stores anymore. You see Home Depots. Well, if I'm an economic developer and someone comes to me wanting to open a hardware store, and they say, well, how many people are you going to employ? And he says, Well, maybe a half a dozen. And that same afternoon, they get an application from Lowe's or Home Depot. Well, how many people are you going to employ? Well, maybe 300. The choice becomes clear. You know, where do you make that investment? Where do you put your eggs? How do you propagate small business if small business is kind of at the low end of the job creation scale, which everyone seems to be concerned about as our top priority?
Part of what happens there, part of what drives that perception is that we have a tendency to think that the Lowe's and the local hardware store would come out of the same pot of money and would have identical needs in terms of what they need from local economic development or community development, and they don't. If they come to the city and say, I need X, what Lowe's needs is going to be very different from what that local hardware store needs. But it goes back. If you're dealing with an environment where the answer is jobs, 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 as I said before, I think that's a red herring. And it becomes incumbent upon us, we have to kind of force the change. We have to kind of force the widening of that understanding of what's important to the community to include a metric other than just jobs. And that's a hard sell. And it's not one that's going to happen immediately. But it will happen, and it can happen, and it does happen.
You know, within the last couple of years, a major retailer, Sears, as a matter of fact, said, how do we get more brand name participation in our stores? And what they did was, in the men's department, they licensed part of the men's department to Land's End. Now, that seems to be a major thing that's happening all over. I know Macy's does it. I know Lord & Taylor does it. Licensing space to smaller or affiliated companies and participating in their growth. I see that the participation phenomenon can spread very quickly given the impetus and the roadmap to do that.
Well said. Very well said.
But some want to chime in when we call this a day? Great. Della, you did a great job.
Awesome.
Thank you so
Wonderful.
much.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. I've loved being able to be here with you.